Day. As I make this video, reports are coming in of an incursion by troops from Ukraine, I choose my words carefully, into Bryansk region in Russia, where they appear to have made some sort of attempt to infiltrate two villages, leading to some kind of shootout with the Russian forces who are located there. These are mainly border troops, Russian National Guard, men from the Rosgvardia organization, that kind of thing. It's very difficult to get a clear account of what's happened, but it's obviously serious enough to cause Putin to postpone a trip he was going to make to Stavropol in southern Russia so that he can remain in Moscow and continue to receive reports from his officials as to what precisely is happening. And I would say that there's lots of rumours from the area, from the location itself. Very difficult to get a sense of precisely what is going on. But there's some reports that this group of soldiers, they've actually published photographs of themselves, soldiers from Ukraine, to use again the expression I'm going to stick with for the moment, that these troops have published photographs of themselves in some of these villages, unfurling Ukrainian flags or flags associated with themselves. And there's also some reports that they've taken hostages and that at least one person has been killed. Now, again, this is all difficult to assess, and I should say that there have been lots of estimates about the number of hostages that have supposedly been taken, and whether, in fact, any hostages at all have been taken. But anyway, the fact that this incursion is happening has been confirmed by the Russian authorities. TASS has been carrying some actually not particularly informative dispatches. I'll read out perhaps the longest one, which is: Russian guardsmen are fighting Ukrainian saboteurs who have infiltrated into the border area of the Bryansk region, defense circles told TASS on Thursday. Groups of Ukrainian saboteurs have penetrated into two villages, taking local residents hostage in one of them. Russian National Guard fighters have entered into a gunfight with the militants. There are both killed and wounded people among local residents, and up to 6 people may be held hostage, the defense circles said. Bryansk region governor Alexander Bogomaz said on his Telegram channel earlier on Thursday that Ukrainian saboteurs opened fire at a moving car in the Klimovsky district of the Bryansk region, killing a local resident and wounding a child. And by the way, there's been reports about the state of that child. It appears it was a girl, and it appears that she survived, that she's come through. And then it goes on to say, the TASS report goes on to say, the region's Klimovsky district was attacked by a Ukrainian drone, and the village of Lomakovka in the Starodubsky municipality was subjected to the Ukrainian army's mortar shelling, the governor said. So this was perhaps not a very big incursion, but clearly a violent one. And as I said, there's firefights going on, and there is a possibility, a strong possibility, that some people have been taken hostage. On that, by the way, I should say that reports that I've seen extend from the 6 we've just seen here to a much larger number, though some of these very high numbers have been disputed. Anyway, this is clearly a developing story, and it's too early to give a clear account of what is happening. But I'm going to make a few brief comments about this. Firstly, the people who, or at least the people who claim that they have carried out this operation, say that they are from a a dissident Russian military unit fighting alongside Ukraine, and that presumably these are Russian soldiers, as opposed to Ukrainian soldiers who are involved in this operation. A few days ago, when there were all those reports about that drone attack on the airbase in Belarus, the claims were that that was the work of Belarusian partisans. I expressed my utter skepticism about that claim. I expressed my utter skepticism about this claim. It's possible that some of these people are indeed ethnic Russians or disaffected Russians, people who share some of the same ideological beliefs that some of the people that we've spoken about before in Ukraine hold. There are such people. Some of them have gone to Ukraine. It's conceivable they've enlisted in some units in Ukraine, and it's conceivable that they have been organized into some units by Ukraine. Having said that, there is no doubt at all, to my mind, that this is an operation that has been at least within the knowledge, the purview, and which almost certainly has been organized by the Ukrainian authorities themselves. Certainly, even if I'm wrong about that, which I don't believe I am, everybody in Russia is going to assume it, and most people in Ukraine are going to assume it too. The only people who might take seriously the claim that these are Russian dissident soldiers just are the Western media, who also, of course, reported with every appearance of belief the claims that the attack on the airbase in Belarus was the actions of Belarusian partisans. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. The second thing I would say is that if this really was an attack on civilian locations, and I don't see anything to suggest otherwise, then the Russian authorities certainly will consider it to be a terrorist act, and that's how it will be presented in Russia, and I think with good reason. Certainly that is how most Russians will perceive it. Now, if the purpose of this attack is to demoralize the Russian population or to shake confidence in the government of Russia, then whoever is behind this attack is, to my certain knowledge, making a very serious miscalculation. Back in the mid-2000s, I travelled to Russia a few times, and whilst I was there, I remember that various fighters from the Caucasus carried out various attacks in Russia and places in Russia, including in Moscow, by the way. And I also remember that those fighters carried out an attack on a school in a place called Beslan in the northern Caucasus, which was within Russian territory, however, and I was in Russia when that happened. And what I noticed was that far from these attacks weakening Russian resolve, they strengthened it. They convinced most Russians that what their government was saying, that the enemy was a group of terrorists, was true, and that the war had to be conducted until final victory was achieved, which, by the way, in the Caucasus it was. And I'm sure that exactly the same thinking will take place in Russia today. This will be very much the mood today in Russia, and it will continue to be so over the next few weeks. There is another possibility, however, and that is that it could be that whoever has staged this incident has done so in order to prevent any process of negotiation taking place. The Ukrainian government has been extremely unwilling to countenance negotiations. They've basically spoken out repeatedly against them. They seem to be coming under considerable pressure from certain Western countries, Germany and France in particular. There's growing rumors that people in the United States, some people in the United States, are unhappy. There's talk that these people are in the United States might also be inclining to the idea that Ukraine should engage Russia in negotiations. And of course, the Chinese government, the Chinese authorities, have called for negotiations to resume between Ukraine and Russia, to the frustration, I suspect, of the hardliners in Ukraine, who include, for the time being at least, President Zelensky. The Russian government has repeatedly said that it is open to negotiations. So, given this, and given that the hardliners in Ukraine, for the moment at least, do not want negotiations for various reasons, which are probably more connected to internal Ukrainian politics than anything else, it seems to me that it could be that this attack on Russia is intended to shift Russian opinion against negotiations, to make it impossible, in other words, for the Russian government to maintain its stance that it remains in favor of negotiations. I'm going to say again that I think this is a miscalculation. I think it is inconceivable that the Russian government will allow its policies to be thrown off course by an event of this kind. Now, the third thing I will say about this event is that what it will do, of course, is strengthen Russian determination to secure this border area, which became significantly more vulnerable after the successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv region. And a couple of days ago, as it happens, President Putin delivered a speech at the board, or military collegium, collegium if you prefer, of the FSB, Russia's counterintelligence organization, which is also concerned with the protection of the border. And I think that undoubtedly there will be steps taken over the next few days and weeks and months to reinforce the border, to make it more difficult for incidents like this to take place again. But I also suspect that it will heighten demands within Russia, that at some point the results of that Kharkiv offensive that Ukraine launched be reversed, and that the Russians regain control of the areas, the regions in Kharkiv, which they vacated over the course of that offensive in the autumn, thereby securing the Russian border in this area. So that's what I'm going to say about this incident. For the moment, no doubt we'll be seeing and hearing an awful lot more about it over the next couple of days, and obviously I will keep you informed. One further point I will now make is that, and this is not about this particular incident, but about the previous incident, the one in Belarus, the attack on the airfield, and the alleged destruction or damage done to the A-50U mainstay AWACS aircraft. Belarusian television has now broadcast footage of this aircraft, and it seems now definite that it was undamaged. So that drone strike, like all of the other drone strikes that Ukraine launched, I think we can now definitely say was a total failure. Now, before I proceed, I do want to make one point, not specifically about this incident in Bryansk, but about the fact that this incident in Bryansk does fit into the pattern of a series of Ukrainian attacks which have taken place over the last few days. We've seen drone attacks across Russia, attempted drone attacks across Russia, all of which were a failure. We've seen drone attacks on Crimea, all of which were a failure. We've seen drone attacks on that airbase in Belarus, and we've seen this group of armed men sent across the border into Bryansk region with the firefight we're hearing about and the rumours about hostages. And I recall that at a time when things were going badly for Ukraine in the summer, they were resorting to actions of this kind, attacking what looked to me to be soft targets. And I said that this was a sign of anger and probably desperation in Kiev. And I suspect this is the same again this time, that with things going very badly wrong for Ukraine, in Bakhmut and in other places, the Ukrainians have resorted to this same pattern of attacks as we saw in the summer. These are pinprick attacks. They're not going to have any fundamental effect to the course of this conflict, but perhaps they are indicative of the state of mind at this particular juncture of the leadership of Ukraine. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say, not just about the Bryansk incident, but about the context in which it has happened. Now, there has been, in fact, a significant amount of reports this today from the front line. Firstly, before I get to discussing what's going on in Bakhmut, there's now reports that the Russians yesterday made a further advance along the Oskol River and that they're now within 3 kilometers of Kupiansk. Now, this has not been fully confirmed. There have been similar claims in the past, which turned out to be either wrong or premature, but this has come from various sources and it may be true. What may suggest that it is true is that there are reports that Ukraine is now trying to evacuate at least some civilian staff from Kupiansk. So it does seem as if there might be a general Russian advance towards Kupiansk, and we'll see what happens there and whether the Ukrainians do stand and fight and seek to defend Kupiansk. Meanwhile, the great battle, the battle that's going on in Bakhmut, continues. And one of the most suggestive pieces of information that came out over the last few hours is that the Russians seem to have carried out a major demining operation on one of the big factories in Bakhmut itself. I seem to remember its name was the Azom factory. And that is interesting because there were lots of reports up to just a few days ago that the Ukrainians were intending to make a stand at this factory and to fortify the factory and to make it into a kind of last redoubt, last bastion of resistance in Bakhmut, a little bit like what happened with the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol. It seems to me that if the Russians have demined the factory, then logically they must control its territory, in which case it's clear, or so it seems to me, logically, that Ukraine failed to defend this factory and that the Russians have captured it. Just saying. So that does suggest that the position of Ukraine in Bakhmut is indeed weakening. And in fact, I've seen a whole cascade of reports that are speaking of Ukrainian resistance in and around Bakhmut now crumbling. I even saw one report, which I don't place much credence on, that said it was crumbling like a house of cards. I certainly don't believe that. But certainly there does seem to be a general weakening of Ukrainian resistance. And I've seen a report from an NGO whose job it was to, which was trying to evacuate civilians from Bakhmut to Ukrainian territory, that they've stopped doing so because the Russians are now so close to the two roads that lead into Bakhmut from the west, that including the northern road, which Ukraine has been using up to now to supply its troops in Bakhmut, that vehicles that travel along these roads can be and are being targeted by anti-tank guided missiles. In other words, the Russians no longer need to use artillery to shell these roads. They're sufficiently close to the roads that they can use guided missiles, guided anti-tank missiles, to destroy any Ukrainian vehicles that attempt to use these roads. And apparently this is now, to a certain extent, happening at night as well as over the course of the day. So it does seem as if the Russians have indeed got even closer to both of these roads, and that both roads now are effectively unusable. And I would add that there seems to be some kind of a debate going on within Ukraine about the advisability of holding on to Bakhmut. Now, there was rumours circulating yesterday and some pictures of what was said to be a petition or a demand from a Ukrainian volunteer unit to evacuate Bakhmut. They were saying that holding on to Bakhmut was simply not worth the cost in lives. I'm skeptical about this report. I'm not confident about its provenance. But I have seen film of what appears to be a bona fide Ukrainian officer questioning whether trying to defend Bakhmut makes any sense. This officer says that on an average day, Ukraine loses 1 or 2 companies worth of troops in Bakhmut, and that it loses in Bakhmut the equivalent of a battalion every week. And he says, well, given the extent of these losses, is it really proper to go on defending this location when the Russians continue to advance and continue to shell and continue to inflict damage and injury? And some officials of President Zelensky's government have also apparently spoken about the possibility of withdrawing from Bakhmut. And President Zelensky himself has, in recent statements, seemed more open to this suggestion than he has been up to now. I have to say that for the moment, however, I've seen no evidence of any Ukrainian withdrawal from Bakhmut, and at least not from the ground, not from reports on the ground. In fact, yesterday, as I reported, all the information was that the Ukrainians were still rushing reinforcements to Bakhmut, and that they're now trying to keep the 2 Russian pincers, the one from the north and the one from the south. They're trying to keep them separated and keep open a corridor for their troops in Bakhmut to continue to receive supplies. That corridor, by the way, is now said to be no more than 3.5 kilometers wide. And that doesn't, of course, just include roads. It includes these swampy open fields and country lanes and that sort of thing. So Ukraine is throwing in men and machines to try to prevent the pincers closing and choking off this corridor, even though with every day, with every week, that corridor seems to get smaller, and with every day and with every week, Ukrainian losses become greater. So that seems to me, for the moment, to be very much the Ukrainian strategy in Bakhmut. And I would add that for his part, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the outspoken nominal or titular head of the Wagner organization, has now published a public letter in which he calls on Zelensky to ignore any advice to withdraw from Bakhmut. He says, Prigozhin says that would be an act of cowardice on Zelensky's part, and Prigozhin says that, on the contrary, Zelensky should continue to defend Bakhmut to the last man. Well, I hope that Zelensky is not taking his advice from Prigozhin, who is, after all, his enemy. But in a sense, you can understand why Prigozhin is talking in this way, because what the Ukrainians are doing is that they're throwing away lives, according to that Ukrainian officer that I've just quoted, a battalion a week, defending an unsustainable position. The Russian losses are said to be much lower. Well, I'm no doubt that they are much lower. So this is an attrition battle, exactly what the Pentagon a few weeks ago was advising Ukraine not to engage in. But it's an attrition battle, which from Prigozhin's point of view and from the Russian point of view is delivering for Russia. It's eliminating more and more Ukrainian soldiers, more and more of the Ukrainian army. Maybe these are not the best units of the Ukrainian army. Maybe these have been pulled back to the rear. But if one disregards the human tragedy, which one shouldn't, by the way, but even if one disregards the human tragedy, these are Ukrainian soldiers. In future battles, they might be put to some use, but their lives are being thrown away to hold on to Bakhmut in ways that I find increasingly difficult, I have to say, to understand, but I'm not going to go over that in detail again. So there we are. That's what the situation seems to be like in Bakhmut for the moment. And just to say that just shortly before I started making this program, Konstantin Gavrilov, who is a very senior Russian diplomat, he heads the Russian delegation to the Vienna talks on military security and arms control. Anyway, he said to Rossiya 24 TV that Russian forces will soon close the encirclement around Bakhmut. And his words are, our forces are advancing in squares and Bakhmut will certainly be taken in the near future because the encirclement is closing. And this I'm taking from TASS, by the way. And TASS also quotes Gavrilov saying it is Gavrilov as the fact that there are large numbers of mercenaries from NATO countries, particularly Poland, in that part of the front line, in other words, around Bakhmut. There are about 20,000 mercenaries, that's presumably a global figure. Everyone has been openly reporting about this and foreign languages are really heard. And however, it is in the interest of the US and its allies to withdraw Western mercenaries and military equipment from Ukraine in order to avoid a direct confrontation with the Russian army. And Gavrilov is quoted as saying, after all, they are gradually dragging NATO into direct conflict, whether they want it or not. Anyway, that's Gavrilov. And as I said, he's a more senior official than others that we've heard from describing the fighting in Bakhmut up to now. So that's where we are. A tightening ring, 3 kilometers only left for the Russians to close, heavy fighting, a big factory apparently cleared and demined, and Ukraine losing a battalion a week, according to one Ukrainian soldier, and that might actually be an underestimate of the scale of Ukraine's losses in Bakhmut. Now, moving on, there's also been a lot of talk, though it's much more difficult to get a clear picture of this, about what's happening near Avdiivka. This is this town, around 30,000 people, basically a big suburb of Donetsk city, which is the linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in and around Donetsk. And I said that I'd seen a map recently. I said recently in a recent video that I'd seen a map which suggested that the Russians are working towards an incremental encirclement of Avdiivka as well. And that is how it appears to be. I've now seen more maps which appear to show a slowly tightening ring around Avdiivka. In fact, in many ways, the picture in Avdiivka is starting to resemble Bakhmut, though obviously on a lesser scale. And last but not least, lots of fighting apparently going on in the Marinka-Vuhledar area, with the Russians engaging in very heavy shelling of Vuhledar, which again, I get the sense that they're incrementally trying to encircle. It's hard going. The Ukrainians again have strong positions, but the very latest report I got from Vuhledar is that the Russians are spotting where Ukrainian snipers are located on the tall, high-rise buildings in Vuhledar, which are a feature of this town, which is, by the way, located on a hill, and that the Russian artillery is now targeting the higher levels of these tall buildings, mainly apartment buildings, and basically acting to kill the snipers who are located in them. So that's the battles. Those are the battles that are going on. Now, I saw recently a tweet by a rather interesting Twitter, a very rather interesting Twitter account called Russians with Attitude. By the way, I have no idea who these people are, but clearly they are from Russia, or at least they seem to be. And they do seem to be pretty well informed, it must be said, about the progress of the fighting in Ukraine and in Bakhmut specifically. And Russians with Attitude said that Bakhmut is the biggest battle of the 21st century so far. And they tick through the various other big battles that have happened, Aleppo, Mosul, and those sort of battles, but they suggest that in terms of the total numbers of troops involved and the total numbers of losses experienced and the scale of the artillery and fire and the intensity of the fighting, Bakhmut has been the biggest battle fought in any battlefield of the 21st century. That may be true. I'm not quite sure whether perhaps some of the fighting in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for example, might not have been on an even bigger scale, but I'm not sure about that. I think, however, that it is highly likely that the Battle of Bakhmut is not just the biggest battle of this war by far, but perhaps the biggest battle altogether that we've experienced this century. But this is, of course, purely, shall we say, a guess. It's based purely on subjective impressions. I can no more confirm that fact than, as I said, Russians with Attitude, that Twitter account, can do. So that's where we are on the situation on the battlefields. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, President Lukashenko has now finished his trip to China, and he is on his way back, as I speak, to Belarus. Whilst in China, he signed off on a very long list of agreements and communiques that he agreed with his Chinese interlocutors, notably with Xi Jinping. And one of the things that struck me about the meeting was the increasing toughness of Chinese statements. Now, I say toughness, though it should be always said that the Chinese, at least Chinese officials, are usually careful in their choice of words. They try to keep the temperature low. Chinese media can be very different. The Chinese media can be pretty strong, and Chinese diplomats, as we know, can also be pretty outspoken. But very senior officials of the Chinese government, including Xi Jinping, tend on balance to try to keep the language fairly moderate. And this is certainly the case in this meeting. But my overall impression was that Xi Jinping and others like him, other Chinese officials, are now quietly becoming more openly outspoken about US policy. And of course, we saw that plan about that position paper that the Chinese recently published about US hegemony, which was frankly very outspoken. But anyway, overall, I got the sense that Xi Jinping's language has gone up a significant notch in making clear China's strong opposition now to the United States and its policies on many issues. And of course, all of this is happening at the same time as the Western powers are becoming both extremely nervous and in some ways extremely excited about the possibility of China supplying weapons to Russia, weapons which Russia might use in the war in Ukraine. So there have been statements from Chancellor Scholz calling on the Chinese not to do that, asking them not to do that. There have been predictably rather harsher statements from German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock. There's rumours circulating, reports circulating that the US government, the State Department, is now involved in discussions with US allies to try to agree a consensus package of sanctions against China in the event that China does indeed start supplying weapons to Russia for the war in Ukraine. I have to say the latter will be most unwelcome now amongst several European governments, especially the government in Germany, well, at least the more, shall we say, rational part of the government in Germany. But what we've seen, the pattern that we've seen, is that once the sanctions escalator gets going, it becomes impossible both to stop it and to get off. And I suspect that having agreed this huge range of sanctions against Russia, the German government, the current German government, if it is faced with demands from the United States for sanctions against China, it's now too divided and too weak to refuse, even though I suspect that the German business community will be deeply upset should that happen. But anyway, I think that is obviously on the horizon. But what did Lukashenko and Xi Jinping actually have to say to each other? Well, the Chinese have not provided a readout yet. I'm sure one will come over the next few days. It's going to be the usual long readout, but we've had a number of, at least a readout not in English, which I can read, but we've had extensive, massive coverage about this visit by Lukashenko in the Chinese media. And one thing I noticed, by the way, is the sheer size, the sheer scale of the ceremonies that the Chinese put on around this visit. It turns out that when he arrived, Lukashenko was greeted with, I think it was a 21-gun salute. There was big parades of Chinese soldiers. It was a huge ceremonial occasion. And of course, Lukashenko himself visited the Monument to the People's Heroes in Tiananmen Square. So it was the Chinese went out of their way to make clear that as far as they were concerned, this was an important visit, and Lukashenko is an important figure in world affairs. That's a little surprising, some people might say, given what a relatively small country Belarus is. But there we are. The Chinese clearly attached importance to this visit. And I'm going to suggest that the reason that they did that, the reason they put on these ceremonies, the reason Xi Jinping saw Lukashenko and all things of that kind, did all the ceremonial and all the rest, is because the Chinese were to some extent treating Lukashenko as a stand-in for Putin himself, who Xi Jinping is going to meet in Moscow at some point, apparently, this month. And we read, for example, that the meeting between Xi Jinping, I'm taking this from Global Times now, that the meeting lasted longer than the two leaders had expected, that a big package of documents on cooperation in various areas was signed as part of the two heads of states meeting, including economy and trade, industry, agriculture, customs, science and technology, health, tourism, sports, and interregional cooperation. Everything, in other words, is there, except notice that there's no reference to military cooperation. That part of the discussions, any agreements on that, in that respect, will of course be classified. We won't be told about them. We're told that the two presidents agreed to expand economic and trade cooperation, do a good job in building the China-Belarus industrial park, and focus on the joint building of the Belt and Road to advance cooperation in connectivity projects, such as China-Europe Railway Express service. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the China-Belarus industrial park, and there's even some suggestions that the Chinese might use it to facilitate the transfer of, say, artillery rounds or drones to Russia. Now, when Putin met with Lukashenko recently, there was a significant discussion about Belarus starting to make Russian military equipment, and including, by the way, resuming production of the Sukhoi 25 ground attack aircraft. Now, that was a ground attack aircraft developed by the Soviet Union in the 1970s. It's sometimes spoken of as the Russian equivalent of the US A-10 Thunderbolt. It's a differently configured and rather conceptually unlike aircraft, but it is very heavily used by the Russian Air Force. It's been out of production for some time. The Russians have been talking about developing a new ground attack aircraft, but it seems that none of the designs has equaled the effectiveness of the Sukhoi 25 designed and developed all the way back in the 1970s. So it looks as if Belarus might start producing this aircraft, perhaps with new engines, for the Russian Air Force, as well as for the Belarusian Air Force. And it could be that with this significant build-up of Belarus's military industrial complex, which was quite big in the Soviet period, by the way, that the Chinese might indeed be involved in some of that, and that there could be a factory set up to produce drones and ammunition and that kind of thing in Belarus, which could then be supplied by Belarus to Russia, but which would avoid a sanctions threat because China would not be supplying this equipment to Russia directly. I have to say that might be a plan for the long term. I don't think it's a plan to address the problems, the immediate problems of the Ukraine war. I think it would take too long to set up such a thing to provide the kind of equipment that we're talking about in the time frames that would be needed to be relevant in the Ukraine war. But anyway, it seems that Xi Jinping and Lukashenko refer to each other as old friends. Xi Jinping apparently and Lukashenko agreed that there were no closed topics, no closed regions for China towards Belarus. And we hear that, and we have a number of comments from various Chinese officials. So this is all from Global Times, or rather Chinese foreign policy experts. So Yang Xin, an associate research fellow at the Institute of Russian, East European and Central Asian Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, told the Global Times that China gave Lukashenko a very high level of reception. In addition, Lukashenko's visit to the monument to the people's heroes shows Belarus's respect for Chinese history and national heroes. It demonstrates the friendly relations and high political mutual trust between the two countries. Zhao Huizhong, an Eastern European studies expert at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, said that President Xi warmly received Lukashenko just 3 days before the annual two sessions are due to convene in Beijing, which show that China attaches great importance to the friendship. These sessions refer, I believe, to meetings of China's parliament. And then Zhao goes on to say the documents signed by the two sides on cooperation in various fields also show the huge potential of China-Belarus cooperation in the future. And we then go on to learn, this is from Global Times, that the two sides will cooperate in defence. As I said, we don't know about the agreements there, but perhaps something is cooking on that front. Judicial and other fields to jointly fight transnational crimes, terrorism, and prevent colour revolutions. So they're closing ranks against the United States and Lukashenko, who was the target of what he calls a colour revolution back in 2020. And by the way, also allegedly an assassination attempt. He's now going to get Chinese help, as well as Russian help that he already has, to ensure himself against that in the future. And we learned that China supports Belarus in becoming a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as soon as possible. I expect that's going to be agreed within a very short time. And we also go on to hear that in terms of the highly anticipated discussion on the Ukraine crisis, President Xi told Lukashenko that China's core stance is to promote peace talks, abandon the Cold War mentality, and build a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture. And Lukashenko said Belarus fully agrees with and supports China's position and proposition on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis, which is of great significance for diffusing the crisis. And we then go on to read that in a joint statement, the two sides vowed to jointly uphold the international system with the United Nations at its core, and oppose hegemony and power politics in all situations, including unilateral sanctions against other countries. Now, that is the last and the most important section. So let's just unpack it. So President Xi told Lukashenko that China's core stance is to promote peace talks. And as I said at the start of this video, the Russians say they're always willing to sit down with Ukraine. It is Ukraine which refuses to engage in peace talks. So already that tilts us a little bit towards the Russian side. Abandon the Cold War mentality. Now that is, if you've been tracking Chinese statements, that's a clear criticism of the United States, and says that it's the United States that is the ultimate cause of the conflict in Ukraine, and then build a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture. In other words, NATO is the problem. It is not the solution. Eastward expansion of NATO is bad. What the Western powers should be doing instead of talking about expanding NATO eastwards is sitting down with the Russians and coming up with a new security architecture for Europe, which recognizes Russian security concerns. And then the next paragraph, the two sides vowed to jointly uphold the international system with the United Nations at its core. In other words, no rules-based international order. It's international law founded on the UN Charter. The United Nations is the key institution. It's not the United States and its friends making up the rules for everyone else. And as if to make that clear, and oppose hegemony and power politics in all situations. And we go back to that Chinese position paper about US foreign policy, which spoke openly and straightforwardly about US hegemony, the US pursuing hegemony and engaging in power politics. So this is a clear reference, again, to the United States, and again, underlining that point, and that they oppose unilateral sanctions against other countries. So countries like the United States, the European Union, any sanctions that they impose, not only at China, Russia, Belarus, opposed to these sanctions, but these sanctions are illegal because they have not been voted through. They've not been confirmed by the United Nations Security Council, which according to Chapter 7 is the only body authorized by international law to impose sanctions. So, as I said, I get the clear impression that the Chinese, following on from those comments that were made in those position papers, are now hardening their stance. And why would they not? Because even as there's all this speculation, all these rumors about Chinese arms deliveries to Russia, which might be used in Ukraine, we're getting reports that the United States is now again considering increasing arms supplies to Taiwan. So the United States considers itself at liberty to supply Taiwan with weapons, but it tells China it cannot supply weapons to Russia, even though China and Russia are friends. And, of course, the Chinese regard US arms supplies to Taiwan as a violation of the US's one China policy, which was the basis upon which China and the United States normalized their relations back in the 1970s. So one can understand why the Chinese are coming increasingly round to the view that the United States is a hostile country to themselves, and why they're starting to invite President Lukashenko to Beijing and receiving him with all this enormous ceremony, and why President Xi is flying to Moscow soon. To say it very simply, the Chinese are now no longer just looking at building relations with countries that they call friends. They're starting to think of them, starting to think of these countries like Belarus, countries like Russia, countries like the Central Asian states, as future allies in the conflict with the United States. And given that the Chinese are starting to think of these countries not just as friends, but as future allies, China's weight will be thrown into the equation to support them. So we see that the Chinese are going to help Lukashenko stave off any further future color revolution attempts. And of course, at the same time, Belarus is integrating its economy more deeply, both with Russia and China, and it's building up its military-industrial complex alongside the Russians, and as part, in a way, of the greater Russian military-industrial complex, if I can put it like that, with the Chinese perhaps before long becoming actively involved. As I've said previously, if the purpose of this conflict in Ukraine, the plan that the neocons hatched, was to weaken Russia and to divide it from China, then it is having the opposite result. The Russians, as I've discussed before, their economy has proved very resilient. They've absorbed the sanctions blow. Their industrial production is increasing. And their military in Ukraine is now making steady, incremental advances. And in Bakhmut, they might be on the brink of winning. They look like they're on the brink of winning the biggest battle, so some say, of the 21st century. And at the same time, the Russians are, of course, massively building up their armed forces. There was that meeting just before the new year at the Collegium of the Ministry of Defense, in which Putin announced his plans, Russia's plans, for a very significant upgrade in the scale and power of the Russian armed forces. So I don't think Russia is getting weaker. I think Russia is hardening, and in some respects, most respects, getting stronger. And as I said, it also appears to be politically consolidating. And even as it is doing that, it is moving closer to China. And China, for its part, is now moving still closer to Russia, with Belarus, of course, joining in. So this loose association of states, which was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is now starting to become a bit more, shall we say, concrete. And the network of Chinese friendships built up across Eurasia is starting to harden into something rather more, shall we say, kinetic and strong and substantial than anything we've seen up to now. And of course, Lukashenko himself, over the course of his visit to China, even spoke about fully integrating the Chinese, Russian, and Belarusian industrial systems into one single whole, which, as I said, I wonder whether he's cleared that with the Russians and what they will make of that. But anyway, that was his proposal. So, as I said, I have to say this. If the plan of the neocons, as I believe, and as many people believe, was to break down and weaken Russia and prize Russia and China from each other, then, as I said, it's achieving the opposite result. And it seems to me that some people in the West are beginning to understand it. There's a very interesting article today in The Spectator. This is a British political magazine, very much one that is identified with the Conservative Party, and one which, by the way, in the past was edited by none other than Boris Johnson. And it has its big article, and the one that appears on its cover is, its title is, it's by Peter Frankopan, "Is Putin Winning?" ? And it goes on to say the world order is changing in his favour. And I'm not going to read this article because the Spectator operates a very strong, it has a paywall. But then it goes on to say, I'm going to read the first paragraph because you get a sense of what's going on. This is not about Ukraine at all, but the world order, said Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, a month after the invasion. The unipolar world is irretrievably receding into the past. A multipolar world is being born. The US is no longer the world's policeman, in other words, a message that resonates in countries that have long been suspicious of American power. The West's core coalition may remain solid, but it has failed to win over many of the countries that refuse to pick sides. Moscow's diplomatic mission to build ties and hone a narrative over the past decade has paid dividends. And, of course, doesn't really want to discuss China very much, but clearly looming behind all the articles of this kind, there is the spectre, if you like, of China and of this convergence of China and Russia. So, as I said, some people are starting to sense, in the West, are starting to sense that this is going wrong. And that may explain, by the way, certain rather curious things that have been happening, because there's another fine article by John Helmer on Dancing with Bears, in which Helmer says that some of the opinion polling that's been appearing in the West, suggesting solid European opposition to Russia, in fact, great increasing European hostility, public hostility to Russia, is based on manipulated data with excessive weighting given to samples taken from countries like Poland and the Baltic states, which have a long history of antagonism towards Russia, and a lesser weighting given to samples from countries which historically have a more favorable view of Russia. So, I think he makes a very strong case. I've noticed that none of the people he names in his article, that Hellman names in his article as being responsible for this polling, have responded, at least not yet, to any of the things that he's said in this article. So the fact that polling is being manipulated, or it seems as if polling is being manipulated in this way, is surely another sign of nerves. So where to go and what to do? I would have thought, again, that it is obvious. When you're in a hole, stop digging. If things aren't going your way, then stop reinforcing failure. I think at some point in the United States, perhaps not in Europe so much, the penny will drop and people will come round and there will be increasing criticism of this policy and perhaps towards Russia and towards Ukraine, and even moves to reverse it. We see that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Josh Hawley, and others, even Ron DeSantis, are now starting to speak openly about the unwisdom of giving Ukraine a blank check and engaging in the Ukrainian conflict in this open-ended way. Of course, the political class as a whole does not agree, but we've also seen from the Rand Corporation study, the CSIS report that I discussed, the IMF study, all of those things, hints from the Pentagon, that there are other people within the elite who are also unhappy. Well, we'll see what they do. The danger is, as I've said many times, that they're going to push Ukraine into a unwise offensive sometime this spring and summer, and we'll see how that turns out. But in the meantime, it's absolutely clear that the geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting, even as the war in Ukraine grinds on, with Ukraine itself being ground down. Well, thank you for joining me again today for this program. More from me soon. Remember, you can follow us. You can watch all our videos on our various platforms. Locals, first and foremost, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also find us. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also support us and also buy yourself some amazing things by going to our shop and buying the wonderful things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.